Hi, welcome. It's Dee from Glasgow Loves EU here on the 28th of December 2020. I do like to date stamp my chats. And we're delighted tonight to have John Worth with us, who is an excellent blogger and expert and teacher on all things European politics. So here's John to chat with us tonight. And Paul's doing social media, and Bernd, as always, is doing our tech stuff. So, John, in case anybody hasn't come across you or is not familiar with your work, could you give us a kind of really brief potted history of your background and tell us a wee bit about those flow diagrams? We used one in Buchanan Street, and it was great, and they're really interesting the way you do those. So.
Yeah, right. Thank you. And certainly thank you for the invite to be able to participate in this. It's interesting to do this, and particularly at this time. Anyway, so I'm British originally, kind of a mixture of English and Welsh. I was born in South Wales, but a good chunk of my family is from Nottinghamshire. I spent most of my earlier adult years in and around British politics in Westminster. I worked as a UK civil servant for a number of years on European Union policy and energy market policy. But I've always had an interest in languages and a particular connection with Germany. And so then in 2013, I had the opportunity to move to live in Berlin, where I've been based ever since. I also made a leap politically when moving to Berlin, in that I quit the British Labour Party and joined the German Greens. So I kind of have experience in two different parties. I work as a self-employed communications consultant. That's how I earn my living. I basically do communications advice for different political clients, all of whom are connected to European Union business. I also teach about European Union politics at the College of Europe in Bruges, which is a postgraduate EU politics institute, where I'm mostly looking at the interplay between politics and digital communications, i.e. how we communicate and talk about politics and how that feeds back into the European Union decision-making process. And then in Brussels, I'm best known for the blog that I write about European Union politics, which has had a kind of interesting history to it. It's been running more than 15 years now, so just under my own name, johnworth.eu. Back at the beginning, when I started blogging about the European Union, people in Brussels said, "What the hell is a blog?" And now they say, "You mean you're still doing that?" And I've kind of lived the whole of that cycle through. And also, I was a very early adopter of Twitter for debating European Union politics. So that's how I've managed to amass quite a large following on Twitter, is not by being particularly good, maybe, but because I was early and people gave me the benefit of the doubt in the early years in Twitter for European Union politics. So I managed, by a kind of combination of all of those different bits and pieces, to stitch all of those different things together in an interesting way. My blog in most recent years, particularly throughout the whole of 2019, was best known, Dee, for what you just mentioned, the so-called Brexit diagrams, #Brexit diagram on Twitter. Which was basically a way and means of trying to plot out what was going to happen in the next stages of Brexit. Because I'd come to the point of view that although Brexit looked a mess, it was not completely unpredictable. You could work out which way different actors in the process were going to behave, which way MPs were going to vote. And if you got the order of what the next steps would be correct, you could basically work out which the different routes were through to each outcome. Oddly, how did I get into that? It actually has a strange connection to Scotland, which is one very strange Maltese academic who was previously at the University of Stirling, called Joseph Mifsud, who got involved in a bit of a scandal in the United States. And I stumbled across this scandal because I'd heard of this guy, Joseph Mifsud, and this whole story was so complicated, I started making diagrams about it. So that's how I cut my teeth of making diagrams, tracking a strange Maltese academic from the University of Stirling, and then I employed those tactics to Brexit, and those Brexit diagrams ended up becoming a lot more famous than the thing about Joseph Mifsud. But there you go. That's all of that. I must say, just like anyone who's ever tried to write a blog about political topics, you don't earn a living out of writing a blog about political topics. Probably Guido Fawkes is about the only person in the UK who can justifiably make a living out of that. So the blogging is kind of a part-time hobby alongside all the other bits and pieces.
So you sound to me a bit like a human algorithm cruncher making those, and I wondered, were you tempted by Dominic Cummings' kind of invitation to go and join Number 10?
Yeah, I would not be the right person for number 10, but there is one thing that's kind of that one of the things of Dominic Cummings has been the kind of, he always talks about these branching theories, like if this happened, then what different future we'd end up with. And that there's an interesting Brexit one there. I really am interested in the question if all of that chaos had not happened with the borders being closed as a result of the new COVID variant, would we even have a Brexit deal now? Right?
Absolutely.
Now, if that mutation had not happened, or if in the Downing Street press conference, Boris Johnson said, well, there might be other reasons why our COVID numbers are booming, which had not forced France for 48 hours to close all its ports and the Channel Tunnel and so on, would Boris Johnson have basically caved on tons of parts of the Brexit deal? And we might be in a very different situation just now. Now, we're never going to know, right? Now, we've got some circumstantial evidence, particularly from Bloomberg, to indicate that actually that was a key factor to determine why he went for the deal. But my mind kind of works like that, in a kind of a sort of an if this, then that kind of way. And then that's also what I'm then trying to think about for the next stages of Brexit, essentially to say, okay, these are the things we know are going to happen in the coming 4 years. There are tons of things we don't know, but based on just the things we know and the branches that we can see, what can we potentially plot out? I'm not really certain I'm going to make any more Brexit diagrams necessarily, because they're very time consuming and also sadly don't get much traction in the UK. They're really loved in the United States and Germany and the Netherlands and so on, but they're not they don't really work in the British media, unfortunately.
No, it's the mathematical illiteracy thing again.
Yeah, maybe. Anyway, we'll see. But they match the way my mind works, and that's why I've kept on making them.
As you're living in Berlin, one of the issues that we've been quite sort of driven by here is the situation of EU citizens in the UK, and also, by extension, UK citizens in the EU. So, from your own experience of living there, are you kind of sorted? Have you got German citizenship or whatever? But what about other people who aren't? Presumably, you know people who aren't, and what's the situation for them?
I've been here now more than 6 years, and so my German citizenship is being processed. I will get it at some point. I don't really mind when, right? Because I also have right to permanent residence. And now, Germany being a decentralized country, each Bundesland has processed those things in different ways. And now Berlin is not known as a very functionally well-organized one of the 16 German Länder, but actually on Brexit matters was the first to move. It basically said, any Brits that have been here for more than 3 years, we're going to give you a sticker in your passport, an Aufenthaltserlaubnis in German, to say you can stay. Because basically the British that wanted to get mortgages, for example, and were getting turned down because they didn't have a permanent security that they could essentially stay. So that was basically fixed much more quickly in Berlin than it was in Baden-Württemberg or in Bavaria, for example. Now, the problem that Brits in Germany came up against was particularly the issue of dual nationality, because of a problem on the German side. The German citizenship law says dual nationality is only allowed, completely allowed, for people from EU countries and Switzerland. Now, Britain no longer being an EU country, therefore dual nationality would no longer work. And the Christian Democrats, Merkel's party, did not want to touch that issue, not because of the British, but because of the Turkish. Right? Because essentially there's been a big controversial issue of dual nationality for those of Turkish descent in German politics. And so basically it was impossible to touch the law. And as a result of Britain no longer being in the EU, that meant dual nationality was no longer possible for Brits. New applications for dual nationality for Brits living in Germany. So basically, any Brit in Germany that applies after the 1st of January will have to give up a British passport in order to get the German one, whereas people in my situation will be able to keep both. There is a backlog of processing the paperwork for some Brits, any that have been here 3 years or less. Their futures are guaranteed here, but they might not have the paperwork yet, which might lead to some difficulties with regard to work contracts or something like that. But generally speaking, Germany's attitude towards the 120,000 Brits that live in Germany has been as decent as can be without being able to essentially change the citizenship law. And so ultimately, I maintain it's much better being a British person in Germany than it would be a German person being in the UK just now.
Yes, that's a tough one, and as I say, something that we've talked about quite a lot. I think we should probably get on to the meat of today's talk, which obviously is going to concern and go around this wonderful 1,200-page document,
Yeah.
which I don't know. You can tell us in a moment. I'll just give you a couple of thoughts. I don't know how much of it you've read so far, but what sort of reaction do you have to what you've read, the commentary around it, and is there anything in it that, this is a specific question a friend of mine asked me to ask you, is there anything in it that you've come across that is actually beneficial to the UK compared to full membership?
No.
I thought that'd be the answer, but I'd ask anyway.
Or maybe not. Depends on your starting point, right? If you were a sea fisherman who fished some particular types of fish, right, that happened to be one where you gained in quota and you weren't exporting it to the rest of the EU, maybe you gain. And if your intention would be to essentially reduce immigration to the UK, then maybe this basically cements those rules, right? But that's more often about feeling about immigration than it is about actually practical measures. So even there, I'm not altogether convinced. There are also these issues, of course, where Eurosceptics have got this bee in their bonnet about foreign judges and the European Court of Justice. So a lot of conservatives see that there's very little tiny role with regard to the Northern Ireland Protocol, but for the European Court of Justice, they see that as a great win. But I don't see that as a win. I don't have a problem with the European Court of Justice, and I don't see why anyone should de facto have a problem with the European Court of Justice. Like, I think the rule of law and control on what politicians, or the limits on what politicians can and cannot do through a court, I have no problem with that. But maybe I'm behaving as too much of a kind of mainland European. I don't know, in my take in that regard. What's the essence of the deal here? The deal is a solid deal for both sides, in that both sides' stated negotiation aims are protected. In political terms, right? It's not a good deal in economic terms, because essentially it's going to lead to friction in trade between the UK and the EU, and that's not without an economic cost to the EU side either. But proportionately speaking, the EU side can bear that cost much more easily than the UK side can. The EU defends the integrity of its single market. It's very, very important. Now, this has been underplayed in the British debate, because Britain has not had that argument about trade deals in the same way as Germany or France has had, right? Like the debate about the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or even CETA, the EU-Canada deal, was fierce in Germany. And it was about, is that going to mean there's going to be products of lower standards which are going to be coming onto the European market? Now, that's been interpreted in the UK media as, well, why are these Europeans caring about standards in the single market? Well, if you've lived that debate in Germany, right, where you've got mainstream political parties broadly of the left, but Social Democrats, Left Party, and Green Party, who repeatedly say trade is political, standards of trade matter, that underlines why the EU was so keen on making sure those things matter in the UK-EU deal. That matters because for political parties across many countries in the European Union, that stuff matters, right? The UK was the odd one in not having had that argument, right? Germans were like, oh, flipping hell, the British now talking about chlorinated chicken. Like, we had that 5 years ago. Like, what took you so long to catch up? All right. Now, the UK, if you see it from the narrow perspective of the Conservative Party, it got what it wanted, right? It wanted to be out of the customs union, wanted to be out of the single market, it wanted to be out of any legal control of the European Court of Justice, and it got all of that, right? So it can claim that that was a political win. Now, the more interesting stuff then comes down to some of the individual pieces of this, right? And when you start looking at the individual details, then it starts to get very messy indeed. So one of the ones that's been exchanging messages back and forth with some environmental people I know is about chemicals legislation, right? So the EU has its chemicals system called REACH, which is basically a database so you can track what chemicals are used in what products, where do they go, where do they get moved, and so on. And building a UK REACH database so as British chemical companies could trace what went where, actually at the time, about a decade ago, cost £500 million to build so as to make sure that was all trackable in the system. Now, it would have made complete sense, but it would have required oversight of the European Court of Justice if Britain could carry on using the REACH database. We don't know, did the British not ask, or did they not ask forcefully enough? But British chemical companies will not have access to the REACH database and going to have to build their own chemicals tracking database. Estimated cost now to do so, £1 billion.
Jeez.
Now, so that type of thing, or the phytosanitary standards chapter in the deal. So that's basically the standards of how many contingents of meat exports in either direction would have to be checked. So how many trucks full of Welsh lamb or whatever will get checked at the border. Those are vaguer in this deal than the EU has sorted out between the EU and New Zealand. Right now, so that or gaps that just don't make sense, like the fact that if you're a touring musician and you want to go and play a concert in another European country, that you're going to need a visa in order to go and do that. Now, most of those, I suspect, is essentially that even if the British raised them in negotiations, they didn't raise them very forcefully because they didn't actually think they really mattered. Right. And what is then going to happen is you're going to see loads of different organizations trying to mount campaigns to get their bit repaired. Right. Yeah. So I've already been sent petitions to sign by the musicians. You're going to have the chemical industries that can be lobbying. You've got the financial industries which are lobbying because they've lost passporting. There's the issue of the general data protection regulation, which is not cleared up and sorted out. The next 6 months are going to be full of dozens of these types of organizations. But what's really, really important, and it's just gone out the window, is the Conservative Party's relationship with business. And that is central, in my view, to this dysfunction. All right. Now, I know some people who are business lobbyists in Westminster for manufacturing industries, even for banks, and they paint a story that basically the barriers went down to communication with Downing Street, not under Johnson, but actually under Theresa May, and did not improve. I.e., this notion that we have central in British politics that the Conservative Party is the party of big business and would do what big business wanted, that was not reflected in this Brexit deal. Right? That's not to say it can't be solved. It's just like many things in Brexit. It could be solved if you wanted to solve it. But my fear is the very people that would want to solve those practical headaches are not going to get a hearing in Downing Street. And that makes me quite worried, because whoever you are, however well organized you are, whatever campaign you'd want to put up, is Downing Street even going to listen to you on those practical points? I'm not sure it is at the moment. So that's overall the deal, though. Now, to me, as I wrote in a blog entry, to me, there's the really interesting point is the review clauses. So the deal is committed to a review every 5 years, and there's actually a review after 4 years of the trade components of the deal. And if you look at the timing, that puts all of those reviews just after the next UK general election.
Yep.
That basically means that the EU issue is going to be on the agenda at the next UK general election, whether you like it or not, right? Forget what's happened with regard to, for one minute, to what's happening with the Scottish Parliament elections. And you also have got a heavy brew of kind of hating of the Liberal Democrats in the UK response, because they're very weak at the moment. But every election cycle, the Liberal Democrats come back enough. And the Liberal Democrats will come back enough to get 10, 12% of the vote at the next general election by solidly appealing to Remainers, which will mean that they will take enough votes from Labour in Northern English seats to mean the Tories win those. And Labour will take enough votes from the Liberal Democrats in suburban London seats to mean the Tories win those. So unless Labour sorts out its European Union position by 2024, then the Tories will win again. And so that review clause basically means these issues are not going to go away. Now, that doesn't mean that rejoin is going to be on the agenda in 2024, but UK-EU relations are inevitably going to be on the agenda at the next UK general election as a result of what's in the deal. Now, had I been the Conservative Party, I don't understand why this is in the deal. I understand why the EU would want it in a deal, but I don't understand why the Conservative Party would really potentially want that unless they wanted European questions to still be on the agenda again. Now, is this another promise made to the Conservative backbenchers with the intention of breaking it? Right? Oh, sorry, a promise made in the negotiations So a few months later, when the Conservative backbenchers scream betrayal, Johnson go, you've got a review clause. Why don't you push for no deal in 2024?
But isn't there also a 12-month notice period on either side as well?
Yes, there is.
So would anybody be kind of crazy or brilliant in their own heads enough to kind of press that button?
I think that the review clause or the incentive for it on the British side is for Johnson to keep his hardliners happy. They can basically say, stomach this deal now. If it doesn't work out the way that we're intending, then we can weaken it further after 2024. That would seem to me the rationale for why review clauses would make sense to Boris Johnson. I can't see any other one that makes sense. If the Conservatives genuinely wanted the relationship sorted, you would have no timed review clauses. You would have both sides can sit and agree to meet to review, but you would not have timetabled it in. So to me, there's something interesting in that. I'm sure that's going to be a key topic some point in the next 6 months. If and when something goes wrong, Boris Johnson's going to go, sorry, we can't do anything about this now, but we will at the time when there's a review.
Interesting. So I mean, obviously, politics drives everything. Their politics is driving everything, and trying to keep their. I mean, it's always been about trying to keep the right wing of the Tory party happy, right. The extremists. So shall we move across to Labour for a bit, because they're in an interesting position at the moment, and particularly with regard to the decision they make on Wednesday as to whether or not to vote for the deal or to sit in their hands and abstain again. So I think you probably have some thoughts on that one.
I find this an immensely frustrating situation. So the first thing to knock on the head is the line that Labour has to vote for the deal because otherwise we get no deal. That is not the case. Mm-hmm. If Labour voted, let's leave SNP, Liberal Democrats, Greens, all the Northern Ireland parties, Plaid Cymru, everyone else out a minute.
We all don't count.
At the moment, right, for the sake of the simplicity of the calculation. If all of them vote against the deal, and we're then only onto the Conservatives and Labour, mm-hmm. If Labour abstains, you need 140 Conservatives to vote against to end up with no deal, right? That is Theresa May's rebellion proportions for a deal that Boris Johnson negotiated based on a Tory party that he shaped by purging out all of the moderates, right? Now, if there are 140 Tory rebels, that means much more than there's a problem with the Brexit deal. It means Boris Johnson's time as Prime Minister is in tatters. Now, that's not happening. The total size of the ERG, the Brexit radicals, is about 50. And even some of them have been saying, actually, we think we'll probably vote for this. So the idea that if Labour were to abstain, that it would lead to no deal is strictly not true. Now, if Labour were to vote against, which the party will not do, but even if it did, you'd still need a rebellion of 40, which is a bit more borderline, right? So I understand why Labour is not voting against, but I do not understand why Labour is not abstaining. Because Labour ought to say, we understand Brexit has to happen. We would not have done it this way. The deal is objectively not a good one for some of the reasons that we've just talked about. So therefore we abstain. All right. Now, Labour instead saying, we don't like this deal, but therefore we vote in favour, which is essentially what they're currently saying, to me makes no sense at all. Now, if you, however, look at the answer, or why people are arguing that, most of the time they've not looked at the arithmetic and fear that would lead to no deal. Is not true if you've looked at the numbers. And second, they struggle with the idea that something is not a yes/no question, right? There are different reasons why you might not like this deal. It might be you want no deal instead, or it might be because you want a better deal. Now, the very idea that a party has a different hierarchy of preferences and something is just not a yes/no question seems to never get a look in the discussion. And ultimately, I find Labour's position incredibly defensive. It basically is saying, we are going to vote for the wrong thing, being in favour, because we find it too complicated to communicate the right thing, which would be abstain. And how bad is that? You're doing the wrong thing because you can't think you can communicate the right thing. Now, beyond that, I'm really worried that the Labour Party just hopes that the EU question will go away. It's been hoping the EU question has been going to go away for the last 4 years, and it's going to carry on hoping that. Now, the politicians driving the kind of vote in favour, so the issue is closed kind of issue, people like Lucy Powell and Rachel Reeves, politicians who basically see that they come from leave-leaning constituencies in Northern England and think that therefore ought to be the Labour Party's line. But there is another Labour Party as well. Like, what's David Lammy going to do, right? Like, he must be going mad, tearing himself up inside. What about Annalisa Dodds, who used to be an MEP, is from the very Remain-leaning Oxford East constituency, committed European? Like, Starmer should also have thought about what it means for the togetherness of the party in Parliament, right, as well. Like, can Starmer afford to lose David Lammy, or do you really want to damage David Lammy's reputation to that extent? I find it an incredibly negative, short-sighted, contorted position that Labour has put itself in. What about Labour in Scotland, right? Like, imagine then that you want to try and win back some largely anti-independence but young people in Scottish universities at the Scottish Parliament, Scottish election in May. Like, that's just shot Labour's chances in the foot with that line, because it's just a gift to the Scottish National Party, by basically saying you want a party that'll defend you, will defend Erasmus, those kind of issues. Well, we do, and Labour didn't. And so for so many levels, I really think it's wrong. And I think it will just, if they keep on pursuing that line, it will lead them to a problem in 2024, but I don't think they've seen it.
Okay, Paul, I think you might have something you want to bring up from social media for us.
Yeah, so really this idea of Labour kind of dodging difficult questions, there's a bit of a history to that, really. But one excellent example of that is Nicola Sturgeon's request for Scotland to, still be part of Erasmus, and Labour not taking a similar line. But then connected to that, there's a kind of bigger question, I think, about defending freedom of movement and selling the concept of freedom of movement as a benefit to society rather than something that only has to be managed, that only has downsides. Yep. And I guess, so I'm interested in your opinion as to why that's happened, why the left in general hasn't been strongly defending that, and what we can do between now and the next general election, because that's going to be a key, obviously that's a key thing, thinking about things like membership of the single market. Someone's going to have to make a strong case for that. And so what do you see happening there?
I must say the Erasmus thing that was really clever politics by Nicola Sturgeon. It was also really obvious politics, right? Like, even before the Brexit deal came out, right, we were debating what would happen to Erasmus on Twitter and whatever, and surely that the Scots would try and opt into it, right? Like, that was a public debate, right? Like, it was just such an obvious play by Nicola Sturgeon. And number 10 just basically, it was a gimme, right? Like, they should have just been ready for that question to be raised, and they didn't even have an answer. And Labour didn't have an answer. It was an obvious one. Like, I find it, how the inability of 10 Downing Street to think more than one step ahead in any of these issues to be quite extraordinary. Now, the immigration one is, again, and the freedom of movement one is really tricky. The most interesting thing for me at the 2016 general election was one answer from a focus group. I'm not a big fan of focus groups often, but this was an interesting remark. You asked leave-leaning voters what they thought the impact of freedom of movement, the ending of freedom of movement on the NHS would be. And they said, oh, it'll mean more opportunities for British nurses. There aren't any, right? Every single British nurse that wants a job has got one, right? Now, the problem is then that leads you to something that I find just this inherent British exceptionalism, which I find so frustrating, that connecting in your head this supposed national treasure of the National Health Service, which nevertheless actually can't recruit enough people in the UK to staff it because the British haven't actually trained enough nurses or enough doctors or enough anaesthetists or whatever. Like, that just doesn't compute, right? Like, the extent to which Britain was not even only just a player in freedom of movement, but essentially built whole sectors of its economy on freedom of movement.
Absolutely.
Didn't feel it needed to automatize its industries or upskill its people to invest. Could essentially just bring in more and more cheap labor in order to manage to fill the gaps. And so I just find that there's just a deep misunderstanding about immigration in the British debate and discussion that you can't, it just goes so deep. I don't know how to begin to address it. Now, we do know that Britain is now, I should probably more specifically say England is now more pro immigration now than it was to a certain extent in 2016. Like, some of that message has changed somewhat. So some of the work that Sundar Katwala has been doing, look at like British English attitudes essentially to immigration. But there's this deep like lack of understanding of what kind of components of an identity mean in England, right? Now, and hence my round of introduction, right? Like, part of my family's from Nottinghamshire. I was born in South Wales. I live in Berlin. Berlin is home. I'm not German yet, but I'm going to be some kind of, when I am, I've got some kind of mix of what matters to me. I've got a very multi-layered identity. Loads of different parts, even of England, but definitely Scotland and Wales have got that understanding. But it's as if the debate and the discussion in Westminster never copes with those multiple levels of identity, or with the practical consequences of what that actually means, right? And that there are different ways of answering a labour shortage question. A labour shortage question does not mean necessarily you need to import more people in order to manage to fill the gap. You could train more people. You could invest more in automation. Who the hell is going to lead that debate? The Labour Party's not going to lead that debate. It's too scared. It doesn't know, right? This laziness, right? Yeah, these people coming to Britain to get off the British, but to piggyback off the British healthcare system. I've never found another European who thinks the British National Health Service is any good, right? Now, really, like, sorry, like, there were pretty much any German I know who's ever been to the UK said, well, I actually went back to Germany to go to the doctor, right? Now, that's not you can't say that in the British debate. Yeah. Now, because the National Health Service is a good thing. Now, don't get me wrong, considering how badly financed it is an incredible thing, right? But in terms of the quality of the healthcare that you get from it, it is not as good as the healthcare which is delivered in many other European countries. Now, until you've worked that out, that if you're from a village in Hungary, it's actually because out of need that you go to the UK to get a job. It's not because you want to, right, in most cases, right? My life here is not a walk in the park, right? Now, there are good reasons why I'm in Berlin, don't get me wrong, and I wouldn't change it for the world, but it's not as if this has all just been a joyous, simple, straightforward process. Now, just how few British politicians have ever lived in another European country to see how that works, right? That just is completely missing. Like that's.
Well, there's a good point about a certain cohort of our British politicians who haven't even lived a life other than school and politics, and they don't know real life, and too many of them are men as well. Sorry, I'm going to be a bit sexist there. But they don't think about other aspects.
The Scottish one, the example I think is just brilliant, is when there was the French Scot, Christian Allard, who got, when he was a member of the Scottish Parliament, they did his swearing in the oath in the Scottish Parliament in French, right? Now, it was a bit, like, a sort of showing how open we are. It was a bit overdone to a certain extent, right? But could you imagine doing the same thing in England? Like, the newspapers would be spitting fire, right? Like, it just would be impossible. How dare he? He's not really English. Like, and to me, that was just a point where the fact you could even do that just showed that there was something different in dealing with those questions in Scotland.
Yeah, I mean, there's something different in Scotland, something different in the water. We have very good water. And I mean, we could go on to that topic, but I think we're pretty short of time. So I really want to get on to the very last thing that we were going to talk about, which is based on your tweet that you gave us. Oh, before I do that, when you were talking about business, I just had that phrase from Mr. Johnson going through my head. I don't think I need to say it, but that the one that summed up his attitude to business. Anyway, so back to the tweet. You said a challenge to pro-EU folks in the UK. In the coming months, there are going to be waves of effort to make you move on. Studies by think tanks, polls, op-eds, etc. What's your organisational response? How do you build now so as you're ready for the 2024 deal review? And so, we think this is obviously a really good point, because we are one of those grassroots groups, and we grew out of a few of us just meeting coincidentally and then deciding to start a group, and I'm sure most of the other groups started like that too.
Yep.
So can you kind of summarize the reaction you got to that tweet, and any advice that you'd give us in particular, but all the groups, about how we go forward, and what our kind of raison d'etre is post Hogmanay, because this is a very sad day really for us.
Yeah. Right. No one should tell people to move on. By all means, look forward, but this kind of British establishment saying, now is the time to come together, we should all move on, is basically saying, shut the hell up. I definitely don't do that. When at that low ebb of Euroscepticism, probably during the Blair years, were any of the Eurosceptics then, right, the John Redwoods and so on, going, we ought to shut up because we've essentially lost? No, hell they weren't, right? They were planning and publishing pamphlets and taking over local Conservative Party associations and so on. And from that low point around 1998, by 2016, they'd essentially won. If there is to be a future for Britain back in the European Union, then from now, those pro-Europeans have got to build that way. Now, do not fall into the trap of assuming that in the sort of, at least the Westminster debate about the European Union is neutral, right? It is not neutral, right? There are certain people who will be invited to speak on talk shows, who will write the op-eds for the London newspapers, because they have views that are okay to the remaining British establishment. I mean, remaining still existing British establishment, don't mean remain British establishment, i.e. the people who've been willing to fold, right, to be behind Brexit. That's why I find all of the arguments which were had in the last couple of months of the extent to which radical Remainers bear responsibility for the hard Brexit that we've got. Absolute tosh, right? Like, really, there was no point right from October 2016, when Theresa May made her Citizens of Nowhere speech, that any person who was committed to Remain could ever have seen anything in Brexit that would ever have possibly met their aims and their aspirations. There has been no practical effort to reach out to those people that were committed to Remain and voted for Remain, and there remains none. And so therefore, as I see it, that the cause of determinedly keeping, or the need for a closer relationship between the UK and the EU on the table, is as vital now as it has been. This does not have to be mass action necessarily, right? If this is 5% of the population, that is important enough. That is going to be make or break for some parties of whether they win a majority in a parliament or not. What is very important, in my point of view, is how do you get the sorts of structures right, to maintain people's activity, keep grassroots people having conversations like this evening, how do you structure those, train those people, organize those people? How do those people have an impact in political parties? How do they network together? What I think is also really important is the role of quasi-intellectual organizations, think tanks, to get an argument out about why a closer relationship makes good sense and what is actually doable, right? So on the one with regard to Erasmus, for example, so there's been this effort by the Scottish government today to say, could the Scottish government join back into Erasmus? And the answer at the first level has been, probably based on the way that Erasmus is set up in the European Union law, and probably based on the trade deal. Probably not, because foreign policy is a reserved competence for Westminster, right? And you could argue it's a foreign policy issue, right? Now, we have a first level answer, but what's the next level, right? What do? Do you basically find a way and means of getting a campaign together that Westminster would do that for Scotland? Or do you campaign towards the European Union and say, well, were you just given an exemption of some sort? Or do you set up, I don't know, a bilateral Scotland-EU exchange program outside of the context of Erasmus? I don't know, right? But you've got to find practical answers to some of those problems, right? And the Eurosceptics have been extremely successful at doing exactly that by setting up a network of quasi-intellectual organizations to push the case for leave over that period. The pro-EU sorts of organizations, right, things like Centre for European Reform or Britain in a Changing Europe, their limit is if it looks like they're criticizing the UK government, right? Because basically UK in a Changing Europe is heavily financed by UK public money. And therefore, to basically say the UK government got this one wrong is not, that's further than they can go. So what's the kind of organization that is in that kind of thinking of practical solutions to get Britain back closer to the European Union, right? At the moment, I don't really see an organization there. What's really important is whoever wants to participate with whatever means they've got, time, ability, grassroots organizing, creativity, you name it, they've got to be welcome. Because the difficulty was in the Britain in the Stronger Europe campaign in 2016, and with People's Vote, those campaigns felt too structured and too exclusionary, right? It wasn't, we're all different in this campaign, but you're in anyway, right? It didn't have the right spirit sometimes, and that led to some organizational tensions. So that's what I would think about. Like, don't let anyone say that you shouldn't have that view. Whatever view you have, it's legitimate. Politely defend it. Find others who will also defend it. And because I'm pretty convinced the EU question is not going to go away, there will be times where battles can be won. It's going to be a long slog, but sort of downing tools on this issue and giving up is definitely not the right route.
Well, I don't think we're up for that route at all. And so before I go, Paul, you've got one quick question come in just to round off with?
Yeah, just a quick question from Bill related to what you've just been talking about. Looking at this specifically from the point of view of young people who are obviously, much more affected by this than us, old buffers like me. Do you think there are specific things we should be doing in terms of organising that are more aimed towards increasing engagement from younger people? Does that change how you would think about what you would do between now and 2024, for example?
It's a hard one. So, of course, there are some individual policies that would make a direct impact. Like, how am I in Germany? It's because I had a good school exchange and I like spending time in Germany. That was formative years as a teenager, which directly mean that I'm in Germany now, right? For some people, that was things like student exchanges and Erasmus and something like. How can you keep those practical routes open as far as you can, right? So, is there something that you can do in the level of a town, a region, to make sure that you step up those practical outcomes, right? That's one, right? That you can do without needing a legal change. The other thing is ultimately is to really solve this, you need to find a way to political power. And
the Glasgow Loves EU party.
Yeah, exactly, right, or whatever, right? Now, the difficulty I find is that, like, for me, I joined a political party when I was 16, and I've forever been a member of parties since then. It's a bit like a drug addiction. It's like it hurts like hell, but I can't kick the habit. in the end, they will determine outcomes here. Right? The only serious way of getting rejoin back on the agenda is to get parties that are in favor of rejoin somehow into political power. And so that is a valid route. That I'm interested in the scope for direct action in UK politics, but I find that a tricky game at the moment, right? That I find the UK, particularly in Westminster, I find the ability of Westminster politicians, particularly this Tory government, to listen to public pressure to be an extremely strange thing, right? You could probably block up Parliament Square with a bunch of farmers for a month and they still wouldn't budge, because they'd have all the media who'd all be going to town saying how this showed that Boris Johnson fought the farmers or whatever. So I don't know how much direct action you could do. But then conversely, right, Marcus Rashford managed to force the government into U-turns in no time at all, but it was not on a Brexit issue, i.e. you can't negate or ignore the fact that how central Brexit is to this government. Like, this government doesn't make sense if it is not for Brexit, right? Now, that's an interesting question, right? What the hell are they actually going to do if they're not talking about Brexit? What the hell holds them together, right? So that's not to say we've got enough examples of U-turns they've suddenly made, but I can't see they're going to do a U-turn on something that's connected to the EU. And particularly not for young people, because no young people vote for the Tories, or not enough of them to make a decisive difference to their electoral chances. So I find that difficult. I'm a great fan of creative campaigning and mass petitioning and whatever marches, protests, you name it. I've read all the literature of how you force social change via all those routes. But I can't see an opportunity or a direct opportunity for being able to do that in Westminster just now. So those are the two I could really say. It's a poor answer, I know, but I can't do much better than that, I'm afraid.
That's fine. I think, we're fighting some other problems at the moment in terms of mass protest or even very, very minimalist protest, which is, which is something we don't really mention much on this chat, but it's there all around us all the time. Anyway, well, that's been fascinating, John. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for your thoughts and your responses to our questions. And it's been great seeing you. And I'm going to do something which this is going to be the last time I do this, because I'm not going to raise another dram until I have good news to celebrate. So I'm celebrating with a dram of good Scotch whiskey. And
I've only coffee here for now, but I have a good German beer at the close of the webinar.
And I'll be crying into it on Thursday night. So
this battle is not over.
This battle is not over. No, this battle is definitely not over.
Millions of allies in the rest of the European Union.
Good. Well, that's nice to know. Look, do spread the word that there are people like us still here, and that we are absolutely, battering the doors down in our own small way to try and get back in. So we'll see. We'll see how.
Anyway, thank you
so
for the invite.
much.
If there are any further questions based on the webinar, you know how to find me. I'm John
Brilliant.
Worth, John without H, JONWRTH on Twitter. Happy to answer further questions there.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good night,
Cheers,
everyone.
John. Cheers.